A reading of my September 30th article, Canada's Unmarked Graves of Indigenous Children Deception, linked below. Today, September 30th, is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a holiday created in 2021 by globalists in Canada's government, part of a racist agenda to divide and destabilize. Everything, except for some essential grocery, is closed as though it was December 25th. Much of the country wears orange shirts with the slogan, "Every Child Matters," today and throughout October. Orange coffee cups, orange ribbons, orange bumper stickers, orange donuts at Tim Hortons. And it's nothing to do with Halloween. This holiday is based on a lie perpetrated by our government, which wants us to feel ashamed to be Canadian, to take a knee, to fork over our money, to give up our rights, to be apologetic, and to hate who we are. They want us to believe we are sinful, dark, and evil, and that we murdered thousands of innocent Native children, hiding their bodies and concealing our crimes. But did that actually happen? Are we the racist criminals, or are they? Background. In 2021, the story broke that the remains of 215 students had been found in unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC. Soon, the media reported that thousands of bodies of children had been found, spread across Canada, especially near the sites of former Indian residential schools. The term Indian has since been replaced by Indigenous. The graves had been located by radar and were yet to be exhumed, pending further investigation and consultation with local elders. But shock and outrage immediately spread across the country and beyond. The world was suddenly disgusted with Canada and Canadians. The insinuation was that bodies in unmarked graves meant the children had been murdered and placed there to hide the crime. Images of evil schools with dungeons full of children and corpses of children came to mind. Midnight burials and mass graves without markers. A genocide invisible to all but the perpetrators and their victims. This exact scene was repeatedly suggested by the mainstream media, as well as many Indigenous groups and advocates. It had apparently been a hidden bloodbath that went on for generations, and suddenly it was all coming to light. Note, tens of thousands of unmarked graves are suspected, but what exactly is wrong with graves that aren't marked? This was very common in such settings at the time. Hospitals, mental institutions, schools, military, and other self-sufficient communities would have their own graveyards, and some graves would not be marked for numerous legitimate reasons. Also, gravestones were very expensive, meaning many graves were marked with a wooden cross or sign, which would have rotted away long ago. Finding an old grave without a visible marker is not necessarily a sign of disrespect, let alone of criminality, but that's what the media and government wants us to assume. The response, rabid outrage, took hold in every corner of Canada, constantly stoked by stories of more unmarked graves being discovered using ground-penetrating radar. Flags across the country were ordered to half-mast and remained there a record 1 year. For the first time ever, Canada Day was cancelled. There was non-stop mainstream media coverage and an outpouring of sympathy and donations. Billions of taxpayer, i.e. non-Indigenous, dollars were promised and spent on investigations. Reparations were paid to various people and groups, with ongoing payments now in place and future lump sum payments to be negotiated. A land back movement began, aiming to give large parts of Canada over to various groups. Each time more unmarked graves were announced, violent protests and riots broke out across the nation. Statues of European-descended people across Canada were defaced, toppled, and thrown into the nearest body of water. More than 120 churches, schools, and historic buildings were attacked, burned, and destroyed. Innocent people were threatened and harassed just for being fair-skinned, Violence was excused and allowed, and riots characterized in the media as generally peaceful, while peaceful anti-lockdown protests were slandered as violent. The Pope visited Canada, called what had happened cultural genocide, and even issued a rare apology from the Catholic Church. Soon after, Canada's House of Commons voted to officially proclaim that the residential school system was not merely cultural genocide and not attempted genocide, but full and complete literal genocide. The vote was called a harbinger of change and has opened the way for further criminalization and censorship of other opinions. Anyone who questioned the official narrative was labeled a denier and racist. People were canceled, lost credibility, lost status, lost families, lost careers. This was a big deal. Meanwhile, millions of orange t-shirts were made, put onto children in classrooms, politicians, professional athletes, men and women in offices. Every child matters, a play on Black Lives Matter, and an insinuation that most Canadians don't already believe that every child matters. And of course, we have a brand new national, quote, truth and reconciliation holiday akin to Easter and Christmas, officially, quote, a day of memorial to recognize the atrocities and multi-generational effects of the Canadian Indian residential school system. Every newspaper and website in Canada has been covered in pro-Indigenous propaganda for the past 4 years. Laws have been passed making opposition illegal. The country has been turned upside down and is hardly recognizable thanks to this massive unmarked graves scandal. Fake news. But the whole thing was fake news. No bodies were actually found. None. Not in 2021, not in 2022, not in 2023, not in 2024, and not so far in 2025 either. It seems that all those, quote, dead children weren't necessarily dead children. After a time, the wording shifted to bodies and then slowly to graves. But a grave still implies a body, so before long they were referred to as potential burials. And more recently they're being called anomalies, reflections, and shadows. From murdered children to shadows in just 2 years. Every headline pumped this story and shamed European Canadians for weeks in 2021. But as the story is slowly revealed as a nothing burger, or worse, a conspiracy to create a race war, news reports of the truth are hard to find. Almost everybody has heard about the unmarked graves, and every child matters. But almost nobody has heard that there weren't any bodies found. No bodies. In other words, they aren't unmarked graves. They're unmarked patches of ground, also known as nothing. Maybe all these unmarked graves are unmarked because they aren't graves. I could point to a bare patch of grass and tell you it's a grave. And it doesn't have a grave marker, so that makes it an unmarked grave. Even more sinister. We have to get justice for the murdered person who was secretly buried here. Oh, you want to see the body? No, my cultural practices don't allow it. But if you convince me to dig, when nothing is found, I'll just say that's not proof of anything. Or maybe I'll claim there's no body because it has been, quote, disappeared by the state, and declare it a crime against humanity under international law. It's ridiculous, but that's where we're at. But wait, part of a bone. At the start of 2023, one of the many digs across Canada announced that the body of a Native child was discovered in an unmarked grave. The elder declared to weeping members of his tribe, and all of Canada via the mainstream media, that the body had been dated and was indeed from the time period in question. This could only mean one thing. The first murdered child's corpse had finally been found. But, it turns out, The body was actually just a piece of a jawbone, and it was found lying on the ground. It was indeed from a human child, the only part of the announcement that was accurate. In reality, dating such a sample isn't possible, so its age was estimated based on the assumption it came from the residential school, which had been operating nearby at that time. Quote, "The coroners dated it about 125 years old, which would place it to when the institution was open." End quote. Yeah, it was dated at 125 years because that's when the institution was open. They implied it had been carbon dated, which isn't the case, and isn't even possible. It was dated merely by assumption. So it could be 1,000 years old, or it could be 10 years old. And it could have been deposited there on the surface by an animal after being dug up elsewhere, or by a person. As for the deceased child being native, that too is mere conjecture because it is impossible to determine the ethnicity of a bone's owner. Furthermore, no children ever attended the nearby school. It only housed teens and adults. The announcement that a native child's body had been found and that it came from the residential school, but the truth is that a piece of human bone was found, no known ethnicity, and it has no connection to the nearby residential school. But only the announcement was sensationalized and amplified. The truth is available if you go searching for it. Even then, you'll be attacked for doing so. It's the same with every aspect of the story and the overall story itself. The claims are loud and unsubstantiated, while the truth only quietly trickles out after the damage is done. The box in the image contains the bone fragment that was discovered in Saskatchewan, adorned with offerings of tobacco and Every Child Matters logos. Quote, "This is physical proof of an unmarked grave," a former student called a survivor of the school announced. Another is quoted saying, "There were atrocities here." Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is, quote, "mourning with the people of Star Blanket Cree Nation and assured them that the Canadian government will support the community throughout its healing journey," reported CBC. But thousands of bodies turned into a single bone fragment that could not have even come from a residential school. The country was irrevocably changed. Historic structures were destroyed. Many people were harmed without any legitimate reason. Denialism, aka criminalizing skepticism. A fantastic logical analysis of the facts was published here, written by Jaime Rubenstein and Tom Flanagan. Quote, "Details were swept aside during what, in retrospect, appears to have been a true nationwide social panic, as other Indigenous groups announced that they'd be conducting their own GPR surveys. Media figures confidently asserted that the original Canadian residential school student death toll estimate of 3,201 would soon double or even triple. One op-ed writer went so far as to declare that the discovery of the graves of the children in Kamloops may be Canada's Holocaust moment." Jonathan Kay. In response, articles appeared all over, bashing the, quote, deniers and others who would cast doubt on the unmarked grave narrative. Here, we are told that, quote, "the greatest tragedy now is the denial and heartless cynicism." Even being quiet on the issue is being targeted, much like the "silence is violence" slogan from Black Lives Matter, with an Indigenous spokesperson ridiculously claiming, quote, "if people don't speak out, then kids are going to continue to die." Various parts of the country became known as crime scenes and the site of mass murders. This propelled a tsunami of public opinion which has allowed things to be done which otherwise would not have been possible. It was given the title Canada's News Story of 2021, more like fake news story. Mass murders? Sensational fabrications to garner support and crush dissenting voices. Jonathan Kay sums it up well, quote, "It turned out to be a story about the herd behavior of Canada's intellectual class. Thousands of politicians, writers, broadcasters, and activists spent months crowdsourcing the creation of a completely unsupported national narrative, and then failed to correct the record once their rush to judgment had run headlong into reality. More recently, Pine Creek IRS reported they found no evidence of bodies after excavating the ground underneath a church. It had been claimed to have been the secret burial site of children, but nothing at all was discovered. The local chief, quote, is aware the results will feed into a denialist narrative of what happened at residential schools. Well, yeah, you claimed there were bodies and got a lot of money and sympathy, then destroyed part of a church, and you found nothing. Now we're not supposed to notice that there's no bodies? In 2025, Canada punishes those who call the ongoing slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians genocide, and punishes those who don't call the Indigenous residential schools genocide. Analysis. We must search for the truth, especially before appropriate reconciliation can happen. Quote, there can be no reconciliation without truth, is a statement I've seen used recently, and I agree. The story and insinuation was that bodies had been discovered, and that Canada was covered in shameful, unmarked graves containing little Native children. The story was not the truth. At best, it was an assumption that appears to have been wrong. The truth is no bodies have been found after 4 years of frantic searching in dozens of locations. That is not a denialist narrative. It's just a fact. A focus on the truth would allow us to discuss the known evils of the IRS system. For example, in some cases, children were indeed taken from their parents. The purpose of the schools really was to assimilate tribes into modern society. Children did die while at these schools, just as they did at every school of the time period. Diseases like TB and Spanish flu killed people all across Canada, including children at schools. But there were abuses at the residential schools too. The IRS system does have supporters, including many former students, but it is impossible to deny that it was massively flawed and did much harm. Discrediting the story with fake headlines about mass-murdered children in unmarked graves does a huge disservice to the real victims of the residential school system, who deserve proper recognition. Besides, there's no focus on truth. Instead, the Canadian government is doing everything possible to stifle open discussion, investigation, or debate. One of the latest pushes was a law threatening 2 years in prison for a wide range of crimes, including what amounts to merely offending an Indigenous person. A good critical and potentially illegal analysis of that law can be found here. There are some who believe digging up graves is disrespectful to the dead and should be done only when absolutely necessary. Quote, this is re-traumatizing our people, said one Native elder. Their concerns tend to be brushed aside in favor of a mad rush to dig. Facts and evidence are being replaced by hearsay and emotion. If anything, the fact that 0 bodies have been found after years of excavating these suspected unmarked graves actually indicates the residential school system was better than previously thought. There have been rumors for decades and increasing talk of reparations, but little interest from the public. Young girls impregnated, forced to have the babies only for them to be secretly murdered and buried nearby, whole classes killed off, children made to kill, eat, and or bury each other, and worse. But it turns out that at least some of those rumors must be untrue, otherwise something would have turned up by now. It looks like the residential schools, flawed as they were, actually weren't as bad as the rumors claimed. Sadly, this hoax has made it less likely real victims of these schools will get justice. I've been doing some genealogy, family research, lately and discovered some unmarked graves in my own ancestry. Yes, even children. The reality is unmarked graves aren't always done to disrespect the dead or to hide a crime. We're made to believe if an unmarked grave containing a Native child is ever found, that it would be proof of European Canadians being guilty of something and that they must provide reparations. Another thing I found in my family history is a great-great-grandfather who helped settle southern Saskatchewan in the late 1800s. He was a minister, noted for treating all people equally, and his congregation had a large number of natives. By all accounts I can find, the local school for Native children was said to be run well and the students happy. I have evidence from relatives who were there and directly involved in the exact places now said to be sites of mass murders and genocide. For the most part, every hint I get from this time period and place points not to murders or genocide, but to a period of cultural adjustment. That period is being re-examined under a progressive modern lens, and our current and future lives are being reshaped. Early in 2025, Trudeau's government quietly announced they were ending funding for the search for bodies. But there has been no official admission that none were found, or apology for the billions of dollars wasted, lives ruined, and racial divisions stoked. Taxpayer resources are no longer being spent on digging for bodies, but billions are still going to reparations and compensation based on the false unmarked grave narrative created in 2021. Here in BC, the government has purchased land and given it to a First Nations group to conduct another dig after they found shadows and anomalies using ground-penetrating radar. Quote, buying the private property will ensure the integrity of the investigation and allow the First Nation to consider how to honor both the children who disappeared and those who were taken from their families to attend the school, said Chief Willie Sellers, as reported by CBC. I notice the focus is shifting from mass murders to simply investigating the entire IRS system. From seizing of children and taking them away to schools to the policy of forcing students to wear contemporary clothing and speak English, the residential schools in general are now the target. I guess if there are no bodies, as promised, the blame has to shift. And while it's true the IRS system is guilty of much, that doesn't explain why suddenly in 2021 the government and media decided to create a frenzy around, well, nothing. Bodies, or was it graves? I mean burials or shadows? And it hasn't stopped. There are more orange shirts out there right now than I've ever seen before. Every child matters! Why the sudden spotlight on these schools? Residential schools are really boarding schools, something we're all familiar with. These were not some sinister torture and murder network. Were they done to assimilate? Yes, in part. Assimilation, bringing in, was seen as less cruel than violence or running them off, practices common around the world leading up to that time. Assimilation through residential boarding schools was done to people of other backgrounds as well, such as the Doukhobors, a religious group from Eastern Europe. See here and here. Not only do we no longer attempt to assimilate other cultures today, Canada has a diversity is strength motto, something almost enforced by law. Residential schools are being retroactively demonized and used to advance a false narrative of genocide. Conclusion. The Canadian government is attempting to shift blame for attempted cultural assimilation onto the Canadian public. Neither the settlers of the past nor the citizens of the present have had or want anything to do with cultural genocide. But certain forces, powerful families, companies, and governments of the past are guilty of trying to erase the cultures of people who lived in this part of the world for thousands of years. That is the truth. As for reconciliation, if anyone is guilty of a crime, they must be brought to justice. Those families, companies, and governments who conceived of and carried out this systemic abuse and attempted cultural genocide must be identified, and if they still exist, be held accountable and made to pay. But reconciliation must be grounded in truth and guided by data and analysis, not heresy. Punishing all fair-skinned European-descended Canadians for something their ancestors didn't even do is racist. It's also divisive. Our common enemies are the racist, globalist, technocrat tyrants. They constantly divide us, and they conquer us. Let's unite. In truth and liberty for all, Drutter. Addendum. During research for this project, I was having a birthday dinner for my young son at a local burger joint when a native person cheerfully dropped off a $5 bill at our table and wished him happy birthday. That act surprised me, as did my reaction to it. Her friendly and giving gesture reminded me that our enemy is not each other, but those who seek to divide us, erase our cultures, and control us. We're all humans, and we're far more alike than we are different. While my personal frustration with the situation may have come through in my writing, it's not directed at Native Canadians, and my goal is to promote unity and truth.